So I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is AJ Metcalf. I am the Media Relations and Communications Coordinator for Maryland here at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the press conference announcing the 2022 Chesapeake Bay Foundation State of the Bay Report. I want to make sure that you all know that this is being recorded. As I mentioned, we're recording it and we'll be posting it to our website about 2 hours after the event, after the end of the event. Should you need it very quickly, please just email me and I'll try to get it to you as fast as I can. So today, we will be detailing the 2022 State of the Bay Report. The speakers will include first Hillary Falk, CBF's president, who will provide an overview of the new report. She will be followed by CBF's Director of Science and Agricultural Policy, Beth McGee, to provide additional information, and CBF's Senior Ecosystem Scientist, Chris Moore, will detail the health of the Bay's fisheries. Lastly, we'll have CBF's state office directors and scientists on the call to discuss state-specific progress toward the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint goals. And as I mentioned earlier, the full State of the Bay report, as well as the press release, are now available on CBF's website. And before we begin with the formal program, just a couple of housekeeping items. After the formal presentation, we'll have a question and answer session, and reporters who would like to ask questions should let us know in the Q&A function their affiliation, that they have a question, and if possible, please type the question in and try to direct it to the appropriate CBF staff member. We are reserving the chat function for technical difficulties, so if you're having any issues hearing anyone or anything, please let us know in the chat. Now we'll move on to the speakers. So it is my pleasure to introduce CBF President Hillary Falk.
Thanks so much, AJ. And thank you all for being here this morning. It's a beautiful morning on the Chesapeake Bay. Today, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is releasing its 2022 State of the Bay report with a score of D+, with 7 of the 13 indicators unchanged, 3 increasing and 3 decreasing. While we've made significant progress, far too much pollution still reaches our waterways, and climate change is making matters worse. As you'll hear later, we are particularly concerned about blue crab populations. But there is some good news. The Bay is remarkably resilient, and there's tremendous energy around the table with new leaders in governor seats, EPA, in our legislators, and the environmental movement. And we have an opportunity to prove that restoring clean water is possible. By following the science and approaching our challenges with optimism and holding each other accountable, we can leave clean water and strong economies for the next generation. Reducing agricultural pollution and urban polluted runoff are the defining challenge of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup at this moment. I know that some of this news is frustrating to some, and I would count myself in that list. But if we can commit to hard work and new partnerships, innovative ideas, we can lead to a brighter future for the Chesapeake Bay. With that, I will hand things over to Beth McGee, Director of Science and Agricultural Policy at CBF.
Great, good morning. Thanks, Hillary. Appreciate you all joining us this morning. We've been doing our report since 1998, and really we started doing it because we frequently were asked the question, how's the Bay doing? And so to do our report, we look at 13 indicators in 3 categories: pollution, habitat, and fisheries. And we really try to use them to tell the story of the Bay by highlighting the connections among the various indicators. Each indicator score and our overall score is based on a ranking from 0 to 100, with 100 being the theoretical score that reflects conditions prior to European colonization of the region more than 400 years ago. The system-wide problem facing the Chesapeake Bay and many coastal and estuarine systems worldwide is too much nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, which cause substantial dead zones and lack of water clarity. In 2022, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution entering the Chesapeake Bay was actually below the 10-year average, and scientists believe that reflects both implementation of the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint as well as historical efforts to reduce pollution, especially from wastewater treatment plants. However, pollution loads, particularly nitrogen, were actually similar to what they were in 2020. And as Hillary mentioned, most states are behind in implementing their footprint commitments to reduce pollution. Worth noting is that collectively, the Chesapeake Bay states are relying on agriculture to reduce roughly 90% of the remaining pollution reductions. Our dissolved oxygen score is based on the estimates of the size of the summer dead zone. That is the areas of the bay and the tidal areas that have low or no oxygen, insufficient to support aquatic life. The size of the dead zone, in turn, is based on the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution entering the bay in the springtime. In excess, these nutrients feed algal blooms, and when the algae die, they sink to the bottom and oxygen is used up, and that's what results in the dead zone. While the dead zone in 2020 was actually smaller than historic average, and this was the third consecutive year that was true, that's a very positive sign. It was not substantially different than it was in 2020, hence the score for this indicator remained unchanged. And climate change is hindering progress. A recent study indicates that because the bay's waters are getting warmer water holds less oxygen, and this actually has offset part of our pollution reduction efforts, the fact that warmer water is having lower levels of oxygen. Water clarity decreased between 2020 and 2022. Water clarity is important for the underwater grasses in the bay, which are a really important ecological feature. Like many plants, grasses need sunlight to thrive and survive. But despite this drop in score, 3 decades of data show that the long-term trend is in improving water clarity due to our pollution reduction efforts. Score for toxics remains unchanged. This is largely due to the fact that legacy pollutants like mercury and PCBs, which are responsible for the vast majority of fish consumption advisories in the region, are slow to degrade, and so we're still finding them persistent throughout the watershed. In addition, we have very limited understanding of new and emerging chemicals like microplastics and PFAS. PFAS are a group of man-made chemicals that are widely used in products such as nonstick cookware and firefighting foam, and we're finding both of these contaminants and others in fish, shellfish, and waters throughout the region. Forested buffers. So let's move on to the habitat indicators. That includes forested buffers, wetlands, underwater grasses, and resource lands. Forested buffers, that's basically planting trees along streams. It's one of the most cost-effective practices that the states are relying on to achieve their pollution reduction goals. Buffers also provide benefits to carbon by sequestering carbon in their roots and stems. They shade streams, they reduce flooding. So from the climate change perspective, they're very important. But despite these multiple benefits, the states are woefully behind on implementation, hence the score for this indicator remained unchanged. Wetlands provide habitat, filter pollution, and they're also important in fighting climate change because their ability to act like a sponge that reduces flooding and dampens storm surges. But according to the most recent data available, only 11% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed agreement goals of restoring 83,000 acres on farmland in the region have been achieved. In addition, a recent study indicates that sea level rise threatens almost 250,000 acres of tidal wetlands and coastal lands in the region. Let me move on to underwater grasses. I mentioned they're very ecologically important. They provide habitat for larval fish and crabs, food for wildlife, and they can actually help remove sediment and nutrients from the water column. The score for grasses remains unchanged, and this is due to the fact that in 2019, we saw a huge drop in the acreage of underwater grasses in the region due to record-setting rainfall events in 2018 and 2019 that really wreaked havoc on water clarity in the region. And finally, resource lands. This includes forests, natural areas, and farmlands. They continue to be lost as more land is converted to development, hence the drop in this indicator score. For example, we have more precise measurements of land use change across the region that show roughly 95,000 acres of farms and forests were transitioned to development across the watershed during the reporting period between 2013 and 2018. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris Moore, CBF's Senior Regional Ecosystem Scientist, to discuss the fisheries indicators. Over to you, Chris.
Good morning. Thank you, Beth. And thanks everyone for attending today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about the fisheries resources at Chesapeake Bay because I strongly believe that most people have their fondest connection to the Chesapeake Bay through its fisheries resources, whether they like to eat crabs during the summertime, catch rockfish in the fall, or eat oysters during the winter like this. People really develop strong connections to the bay through these fisheries resources. So I wanted to start out with perhaps the most iconic species in Chesapeake Bay, and obviously an indicator in our report, the blue crab. Not surprisingly, this indicator dropped this year, as was well documented earlier this year. The blue crab population was recorded as being the lowest since we started monitoring it through the Winter Dredge Survey back in 1990. On the positive side of this low number has spurred action by the Bay jurisdictions and NOAA to start a comprehensive stock assessment of the population that will hopefully inform our scientists and our managers moving forward and allow us to manage the species in a way that brings it back to its former numbers. Moving forward, though, one of the things that has been discussed earlier, the number of underwater grasses out there. These are extremely important habitats for blue crabs, and ensuring our continued water quality improvements to ensure abundant underwater grasses is extremely important for the blue crab population. In addition, managing non-native invasive species such as blue catfish are also going to be another important effort to ensuring a more healthy, robust blue crab population moving forward. Next, I wanted to move on to striped bass, another species that has received a lot of press as of late. This is a species which many recreational anglers and the businesses that they support have profoundly missed the historic abundances of striped bass we've seen in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. Fortunately, some things are moving in the right direction when it comes to blue crabs, and so, striped bass. So we're seeing a slight increase in the score this year. On a coastwide basis, and remember, striped bass are found throughout the Atlantic coast, from basically North Carolina north to Maine, and actions initiated by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission have helped reduce catches of striped bass to a more sustainable level. Unfortunately, our reproduction in the Chesapeake Bay especially has been very low to average over the last 3 to 4 years, and we need to better understand the impact of climate change on these low reproduction numbers. Generally, striped bass want to see cool, wet springs in order to ensure the highest level of spawning success, and climate change is imperiling our ability to have those type of events. Also moving forward, we need to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem for the juvenile striped bass out in the Chesapeake Bay, and ensure that we have plenty of forage for those fish such as menhaden, in order to make sure those fish are as healthy as possible moving forward. Finally, I wanted to touch on perhaps the biggest keystone species in Chesapeake Bay, the oyster. Obviously a species that we're in the midst of harvest season right now. It's actually also the species that has the biggest increase in our fisheries indicators this year. Oysters are so important because they create this unique three-dimensional habitat here in the Chesapeake Bay that serves as homes for over 300 different species of other fish, shellfish, and plants at different times throughout the year, and depending upon where they are located in Chesapeake Bay. Although the overall score for oysters is still relatively low, we are seeing really strong signs of success in our oyster restoration management efforts throughout the Chesapeake Bay, and we hope to build on those in the future. In addition, both Maryland and Virginia have recorded some of their highest rates of oyster reproduction in the last 30 years. So this is very good news as well. Moving forward, ensuring wise management of our oyster resource during times such as this, when oysters are reproducing successfully, is really important, because in the past, sometimes we have been in somewhat of a boom and bust cycle due to harvesting too many of these organisms when they are abundant, and therefore basically taking away the future positive effects of those areas of high abundance and times of high abundance. As our score indicates, though, we still have a long way to go in terms of making sure we get to a restored oyster population in Chesapeake Bay. In addition, climate change can drastically affect oyster reproduction in any given year. So we need to ensure that we continue to dedicate the necessary resources to restoring oysters at the tributary scale in Chesapeake Bay, and ensuring we conservatively and wisely manage our oyster fisheries moving forward. So now I wanted to turn it over to Harry Campbell, who's our PA Director of Science, Policy, and Advocacy.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Harry Campbell, the Science, Policy, and Advocacy Director in the Pennsylvania office of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. As this year's State of the Bay report concludes, a lot of work is left to be done to save the Bay. And much of that work will be done in Pennsylvania. But unlike so many other years, 2022 brought with it renewed hope in Pennsylvania. Most notably, the state legislature passed legislation creating a $22 million Clean Streams Fund. Over the coming years, this fund promises to restore and protect the state's 86,000 miles of rivers and streams. The hallmark of this fund is a new statewide program called the Agricultural Conservation Assistance Program, or ACAP for short, which will help Pennsylvania's 50,000 plus family farmers design and install conservation practices that keep soils and nutrients on the farm instead of in the water. Agricultural activities impair 6,400 miles of rivers and streams in Pennsylvania and are the leading source of nutrients and sediment pollution from the Bay to PA. So this fund will help local communities also reduce polluted stormwater runoff, treat acidic mine drainage, and plant millions of trees alongside streams, streets throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania. But challenges remain. Pennsylvania's Clean Water Blueprint contains many notable improvements over previous years, but falls short and continues to do so. Last November, EPA rejected the state's third try at creating an acceptable plan. It's imperative that the incoming Shapiro administration complete this plan. But a plan is only as good as it's. ACAP and the Clean Streams Fund are a down payment on the new legislature and Shapiro administration must dedicate sufficient sustainable funding investments to restore Pennsylvania's 28,000 miles of impaired rivers and streams and meet our Clean Water Blueprint commitments to the Chesapeake Bay. Furthermore, there's an urgent need for increased outreach and technical assistance at the local level to reach landowners and communities and match them with programs and help them design and install these conservation practices. The impacts of climate change loom large as well, already impacting Pennsylvania with more polluted and hot stormwater runoff, increased flooding and eroding stream banks that strip oxygen from our aquatic ecosystems. Yet there is hope. Those very same pollution reduction practices Pennsylvania is relying upon to meet its blueprint commitments, increased soil health and planting millions of trees, and other priority areas are those that mitigate many of the impacts of climate change. Success demands two things: Pennsylvania to do its part to reduce pollution, and if they don't, continued EPA action. Today, Pennsylvania has momentum. It can be the hero in this story. With a complete plan and the resources to implement it, Pennsylvania will help the region make history. And now I'd like to introduce Josh Kurtz, our Maryland Executive Director.
Thank you, Harry. Good morning, everybody. I'm Josh Kurtz. I'm the Maryland Executive Director here. And when we evaluate the health of the Bay in the state of Maryland and the progress we've made, we see that a bulk of that progress has come from our wastewater treatment plant upgrades. And that really stems from dedicated funding through the Bay Restoration Fund that was created by legislation. And while this program has been extremely successful, we have seen over the past couple of years some of our most important and largest plants begin to fall out of compliance. In order to make sure that we're capitalizing on the investment we've already made and improving the water quality in Maryland, we need to make sure that we're improving the oversight and enforcement of these facilities to protect not only the water quality, but the residents of Maryland that rely and live by the water. Two other areas that we track heavily and have been mentioned before are runoff from our cities and our farms. And as more and more fresh water comes in due to climate change, we are seeing different challenges and increasing challenges in some of these spaces. In our cities, urban runoff is really one of the most increasing and largest increasing sources of pollution into the Bay in Maryland. While agriculture and farming has decreased, it just hasn't quite been at the pace that we need. There are a couple new tools, though, in the toolbox that we're really excited about. The passage of the 5 Million Trees program in Maryland kicked off this year with a bit of a bang. The initial round of funding for the Chesapeake Bay Trust for the Urban Tree Program was oversubscribed. So we saw several community members, several groups want to be involved in the solution here. And one great thing about these trees is that they create multiple benefits, not just water quality, but carbon sequestration, cooling our communities, and helping with the health of the Bay. As this program continues to build, we have a working group that's looking on how we can increase our forests, not only in the urban spaces, but in our suburban communities and in farms as well. On the flip side of that, though, a new study by the Harry Hughes Center really showed that we have more work to do on forest protection. We're currently losing around 3,000 acres of trees to development per year. And as importantly, what we saw in this study, which relies on really fine-scale new data, is that fragmentation is causing a decline in our forest health. Something else that we need to work on to make sure that we're protecting our water quality and our ability to mitigate climate change. In the farming community, we have seen progress, and that's due to farmers digging in and putting permanent conservation practices in place. And while we know we need to drastically accelerate these practices and the adoption of these practices, we have seen more and more farmers enrolling in programs and putting them across their fields. This improves soil health, which increases our water quality. It reduces carbon sequestration by kind of pulling that carbon out of the air and sequestering it into the plants. And it also retains soil, which is an incredible benefit for the farmers as well. We're excited about the progress that's being made and some very strong programs that have been rolling out in Maryland. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Peggy Sanner, the Virginia Executive Director.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for being here today and paying attention to some of the important considerations set out in the State of the Bay report. I'm Peggy Sanner, the Virginia Executive Director. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how we in Virginia are working to address the challenges, the significant challenges that have been identified in the State of the Bay report. The work that we're doing in Virginia takes place throughout the year, of course, but many efforts will be front and center during the upcoming General Assembly session. So I'll speak about that arena first. We are urging legislators to continue to accelerate progress in reducing pollution, first of all, by fully funding the essential conservation programs that reduce nitrogen and phosphorus pollution to our waterways. Upgrading sewage treatment across the state has brought about striking progress in some of our rivers, but the work is far from complete, and inflation and supply chain issues have added challenges. Legislators have to keep their foot on the pedal for wastewater with the addition of $300 million additional dollars that are needed for this year's, that are needed and that are possible by the high revenue levels that we see in Virginia this year. Our farmers for years have been working hard at practices that keep priceless soil and nutrients on the land and out of the water, but funding for these efforts has always represented a tiny fraction of the need. This year, legislators need to turn that history around with an infusion of about $140 million to help these efforts. But it's not just money. We're also asking our leaders to consider new ways to accelerate progress in the agricultural sector by instituting special incentive funding for grants to farmers that adopt the most cost-effective and long-term practices, such as buffers consisting of trees and vegetation and fencing at the edge of streams. We are seriously behind in our commitment and our adoption of this very important work, and we're hoping an incentive fund will help to turn that around. We also need to boost assistance to the Virginia cities and towns in their efforts to reduce polluted runoff, which is an area where Virginia, like the rest of the region, is woefully lagging. In one instance, Alexandria, Richmond, and Lynchburg all have very outdated combined sewer systems that, in times of rain, spew untreated sewage into the James and Potomac rivers. But all three cities are making remarkable progress to end that flow. Alexandria is constructing a state-of-the-art massive tunnel system, which will temporarily store and then treat the sewage before it goes into the Potomac. That system will come online in a few years. Lynchburg, with the smallest system, is nearing completion of its own work in this area. And Richmond, which has by far the largest and most challenging task to upgrade its combined system, is nonetheless forging ahead. We are urging legislators to continue financial assistance to Richmond in its efforts to clean up the James River and ultimately the Bay for recreation, habitat, and quality of life. We are also working to protect some of our most important resources, including forest and urban tree canopy, farmlands, and tidal wetlands from unwise development. One important step is to require, through laws and regulations, of course, strong mitigation for losses and impacts to these lands, whether by unwise development or even by the promising and necessary growth of the solar arrays that are needed for climate mitigation. We are literally planting trees in our developed areas like Richmond, Hampton, and Portsmouth, where one legacy of former unlawful discriminatory practices is urban communities covered in asphalt and suffering under intense summer heat. This is in great contrast to the relative coolness of nearby leafy suburbs. And we are deeply committed to ensuring that Virginia takes wise and aggressive steps to mitigate climate change, devises and takes resilience measures that support our longstanding water quality work, and that are protective of often under-resourced communities that are threatened by sea level rise along the coastline and flooding from increasing and more destructive storms across the Commonwealth. Thank you for listening to this effort, and I now pass the baton to CBF's Federal Affairs Director, Keisha Sedlicek.
Thanks, Peggy. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today. I'm Keisha Sedlicek, the Interim Federal Director. On the federal level, the past 2 years have yielded a massive influx of funds that potentially could go into restoring the Bay with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. We're thankful to all of our champions who helped with the passage of those bills. Now it is critical that the Biden administration prioritize getting those funds out the door and distributing them in a way that tackles the largest sources of pollution into the Bay, like agricultural pollution. These funds can be and should be used to support farmers who use practices that help stop this type of pollution at its source, improve water quality in local waterways in the Bay, and build more climate resilient farms. Additionally, the 118th Congress is due to reauthorize the Farm Bill this year. It's critical that Congress uses the Farm Bill as a vehicle to invest more into conservation funding for farmers in the Bay region and to provide necessary resources to USDA to hire the technical experts needed to help farmers put these practices in place on the ground. We need to seize the opportunity to devote more federal funds to agricultural conservation throughout the watershed, which benefits local economies and the Bay. Thank you. I'll now turn it back over to AJ Metcalf.
All right, thank you, everyone. That ends our formal presentation by the speakers today. Now I'm going to open it up to question and answer session for reporters. So reporters, if you could just type your name and affiliation in the question and answer, and potentially a short summary of your question. We'll open up the floor to you to ask it directly to one of the staff members who are on the call. So the question and answer session is now open, and we await your questions. Thanks. Emily, can we spotlight Everett?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Everett.
Hi. Yeah, so can you speak a little bit more about the incentive fund that might be brought up in the General Assembly? Is this going to be a grant-based program, or I don't know, potentially incentives through subsidies instead? How might the farmers get that money?
Everett, sorry, Peggy, this is a question for you. This is Everett from the
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes.
the Virginian pilot. So he's asking about that incentive fund.
Good morning, Everett. Thanks for asking about that fund, which we're actually pretty excited about. What we're hoping we'll see is a proposal to set aside about $8 to $10 million to do a pilot program, which will provide for special grants over and above what is currently available for farmers who are implementing these really important long-term practices like stream-side buffers. As you have heard from several of us, we are far behind in those practices. They are the most cost-effective. Some of them will last and give water quality and soil preservation benefits for 15 or more years. So it's really fiscally sensible for the state and Virginia taxpayers. And we're hoping that when these grants, assuming the program passes, become available, they will spark the interest of farmers who have thus far not been able to adopt these practices. So stay tuned, and we're of course happy to talk with you about that as the session proceeds.
Thanks, Peggy. Everett, did that answer your question? Do you have any follow-up?
No, I don't. Yeah, that answered my question. Do you expect, or I guess I have one follow-up for that. Do you expect the money to become available this year, or will it likely be kind of doled out in 2024?
Another very good question. What we see this year is efforts, the General Assembly will be tweaking the budget for the state for the second year. So our hope is that all of the money that we hope they pass will be available for use this year. We're also hopeful that if the program is successful, these funds will be renewed in future years. But all of that will take certainly work, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
All right, thanks, Peggy. Next, we're going to go to Steve Davies at AgriPulse Communications. This looks like a question for Harry Campbell. Emily, can we unmute him?
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
You can hear me. Yeah, I'll just read this. How soon might we see the benefits of clean streams funding in Pennsylvania, as in projects that are actually in place and working?
Well, good morning, Steve. Great question. The Clean Streams Fund is a myriad of programs that are some new and some existing. So for the funding that's going to the existing programs, that funding is going to be available through the myriad of ways the programs are administered, grant rounds and other ways, right now. The hallmark, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, of the Clean Streams Fund, of which 70% is going towards that new agricultural cost share program. The rules of the road for that are in the final stages of development. And in fact, they should be open eminently for county conservation districts to start to take advantage of. So as it pertains to then resulting in the design and implementation of those practices, that's going to occur at a variable rate based on where that funding is going from. But with ACAP, we anticipate and expect that actually we'll start to see implementation of some of the easily designed and implemented projects like forested riparian buffers and cover crops and things of that nature, stream bank fencing in particular, this spring. So we're really excited about the fact that this money is actually going to be able to translate down onto the ground in implementation very rapidly.
Thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Steve. Next, we're going to go to Lauren Bass from News 3 in Virginia. I believe this is a question for Peggy. Can we unmute Lauren?
Hi there, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you guys again for hosting this session. One thing that I noticed from a lot of the different speakers today is that a lot of the ending notes or thoughts after their presentations were that they want for the allocation of certain funds to be aided in these efforts to help progress and keep these numbers in a safe space. What kind of legislation are you all looking for? I know the previous question was asking about a certain fund or act, but what other legislations are y'all looking for? Are there newer legislations, or are there things you guys are just working on currently that you guys are really trying to get through, just for the everyday person to understand when we break this down in a story later today?
Peggy?
Thank you, Lauren. We always start off in talking about our work with what the funding is available and what is needed, because the state needs to pass its budget every year, and that's what keeps this work moving. We've got a long-standing program that helps our sewage treatment plants upgrade. As I mentioned, that's progressing very well. But it's expensive work, it's cost-effective work. We just need to keep the funding coming so that the cost of that work don't fall too heavily on ratepayers in towns and other communities. In the agricultural side, we have a longstanding cost share program. Many of the practices that are important for water quality, we've mentioned stream side fencing, buffers, cover crops, nutrient management plans. There are scores of these practices, and Virginia provides a portion of the cost of each of those practices to farmers who adopt them. So that's a really essential program. And unfortunately, over the years, it's been very much underfunded. So we're looking to take advantage of some high levels of revenue this year to really jumpstart renewed efforts. We also have another program. It's called the Stormwater Local Assistance Fund, which again provides a portion of the cost for doing stormwater management, keeping pollution from runoff out of our waterways, provides a proportion of those costs to our cities and towns to help them undertake those efforts. So it's the state being a partner to all the parts of our communities that will help reduce pollution to waterways.
Understood. And a follow-up question I have is, how is the everyday person affected by this? I think I heard someone previously state like taxes. If you guys are looking for an increase or a continuation of funds, do you all see a tax on the everyday person being a part of the solution? Or are there any other ways that people of the Hampton Roads community could get involved without necessarily being taxed?
You know, the programs that I mentioned, as I said, have been a long-standing part of our efforts for the Bay, which I think, you know, benefits Hampton Roads really directly. You all, I'm speaking from Richmond, you all in Hampton Roads live with the water and so get the benefits of clean water on a daily basis. So what we're talking about would not contemplate new taxes, but rather continuation of long-standing commitments. But I will say the other piece of your question had to do with how everyday citizens can understand the benefits. In Richmond, we talk about cleaning up the James River so that people can swim in the river. People can fish and eat the fish from those rivers, from that river. You all in Hampton Roads have that set of opportunities in the tidal waters in spades. And so we're hopeful that everyday citizens will recognize how important this effort is overall.
All right, thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Lauren. We have a lot of questions. I see Freddie Kunkel from the Washington Post has his hand up in chat. So I was wondering if we can unmute him so that he can ask his question, and then we'll get back to the other open questions from Catherine, Scott, Kayla, and others.
Okay, thank you. My question is that the report says that states are relying 90% on reducing pollution from agriculture. And I'm wondering, does that reflect the actual impact on the Bay from agriculture, despite progress on that front, or the fact that state legislatures in the region may actually encounter less resistance focusing on agriculture than, say, regulating suburban development? And a related question is it safe to say the biggest impact or problem is industrial farming, such as poultry farms, or do the bigger industrial agriculture enterprises actually have better controls in place than, say, small family farms? And I can send that into the Q&A as well.
Yeah, thanks, Freddie. I think this might be best for Beth to take a shot at it first.
Yeah, thanks. Great questions. I wrote them down. A lot to unpack there. First of all, so agriculture, right? So if you look at the state plans, the remaining reductions for most of the states need to come from agriculture, over 90%. That reflects a couple of things. One is we've done a great job, as you've heard, on wastewater treatment plants. So the loads coming from wastewater treatment plants have now been really pretty well addressed. Also, obviously some issues in Maryland, but we've done a great job in wastewater. So that source sector has been largely controlled. Agriculture is the second largest land use in the Bay watershed behind forests. So we have a lot of land in agriculture. And so there's a lot of pollution coming from agriculture. So that's one reason why it's remaining. It's also a tough nut to crack because it's largely not regulated under the Clean Water Act. So we have to mostly rely on either state regulations or cost share programs that we've talked a lot about to get pollutions from agriculture. The good news is, as you've heard, one is that getting pollution reductions from agriculture is actually very cost effective in terms of pounds reduced per dollar invested. There are multiple environmental benefits besides clean water to climate mitigation, climate adaptation, resilience of our communities. So that is, I guess, explains sort of why ag is the big kahuna left to be done. In terms of the, industrial versus small farms, Harry talked about farms in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has more than 32,000 farms in the Bay watershed part of Pennsylvania. Those are mostly small farms. They are not the big industrial farms. They are 100-cow dairy farms with 50 acres, 100 acres. So really the challenge is we obviously need to be reducing pollution from our large industrial farms. They are, many of them, regulated on the Clean Water Act, but really the challenge is these smaller farms that have state regulations that apply, but are really struggling financially, and we need to get them resources that they need. I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in or whether Freddie, I answer your question, but those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Beth. Freddie, did you have any other follow-up, or was that it?
No, thank you. That's absolutely on point. Thank you very much.
He's muted.
We just heard him. Thanks, Freddie. Next, we're going to go to Catherine Hafner with WHRO Public Media. Catherine, you should be unmuted.
All right, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Good morning. My question is, these reports can be sort of granular with the indicators. So I'm hoping you could kind of give me the upshot here for the average person who lives near and interacts with the Bay. Like, how do you weigh the negatives and positives here?
Beth, do you want to take that one first? Just kind of an overall, the elevator pitch of the State of the Bay report. Beth, I think you may be muted.
I think Beth might be frozen. Oh, maybe not. Beth, can you hear us? If not, I can jump in first. Oh, she's having some problems. And just say, while there's some big challenges in this report that are pretty evident, and we have a lot of work to do to restore clean water to the Chesapeake Bay and address the impacts of climate change. But you've also heard a ton of momentum in the state capitals with new leadership at the EPA. And so while there are not as many upticks on indicators as we would like, we see a lot of opportunities in the next couple of years to have a pretty important impact on these indicators and the overall health of the Chesapeake Bay. We'll see if that gave Beth enough time to get back on.
Are you waiting for me? Sorry, I only got part of the question before my computer froze.
Catherine had asked basically, what should be the takeaway from this report? What's basically the elevator pitch of it?
Yeah, I think, there's some good news and some bad news. Climate change is making our task more challenges, as you heard, in many fronts. And, again, the fact that we haven't changed since 2020, the positive of that is we haven't gotten any worse. But we need, in terms of implementation, as Hillary mentioned, there's still hope. There's new leadership, great news in Pennsylvania, great opportunities at the federal level. So the Bay is hanging in there. We need to reduce pollution to give it an ability to restore itself and give us a healthy watershed and waterways.
Thank you, Beth. Next, we're going to go to Scott Broom at WUSA 9. It sounds like this would be a question for Keisha. Scott, you should be unmuted.
There you go. Thank you for the unmute cue. I'm looking for a broad figure, if one even exists, on how much federal money out of these two big bills, infrastructure and Inflation Reduction, may flow to the watershed specifically. I know that's probably a difficult number to get to, but if you can throw that at me. And I'm also looking for a broad comment that might help educate my audience in this climate change challenge. We just addressed it a moment ago, but somebody who could chime in and sort of suggest that the climate change environment has made the future of progress that much more difficult, and help my audience explain why. So one, a number, and two, a broad commentary on climate change challenges. Thanks.
Hi, Scott. I know you're going to want a number from me. I don't have one. It's in the millions, potentially billions, depending on how you calculate things. I will throw a few numbers at you, I promise. So in the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA Chesapeake Bay program got $238 million over 5 years. Also, part of that was EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Funds, got $11.715 billion over 5 years, and it's estimated that 20% of that will come to the watershed. So as I said, it's major dollars. In the Infrastructure Reduction Act, it was $20 billion to USDA for their conservation efforts and technical assistance to farmers. How much of that trickles to the watershed? We're pushing for a lot. So I think it's TBD on how much of that actually flows to the watershed, but we're talking millions, billions of dollars that potentially could be coming here to address pollution. Beth, I'm gonna, I think, kick it to you on the climate change.
Keisha, I see Jacob Fenston also has pretty much the same climate question. Jacob asked in the Q&A, can someone summarize the various ways climate change is impacting the Bay and progress on the cleanup? So I think let's handle that one as well with that.
Sure. So more severe storms, more precipitation means more pollution coming into the Bay, more land, more water and pollutants running off our farmlands and our urban areas. So that adds more pollution to the Bay. We're trying to reduce pollution to the Bay. So that in and of itself is a challenge. And the estimates are that by 2025, we need to reduce an additional 5 million pounds of nitrogen, for example, just to achieve our existing goals. Dissolved oxygen, I mentioned that warm water holds less oxygen. So all things being equal, the big problem we're trying to fix in the Bay is the dead zone. All things being equal, warmer water holds less oxygen. So that is also a challenge for us. Chris talked about some of the fisheries impacts related to warmer waters. Another example of a warm water impact is that eelgrass is a really important underwater grass in the Bay region, mostly in the saltier southern parts of the Bay. It is at the southern end of its northern distribution, so it doesn't like warm water. And when we have really hot summers, we see massive eelgrass die-offs. And in fact, some scientists believe we're going to lose eelgrass from the Bay within the next couple of decades. So those are the big challenges. But I always like to end on an optimistic note, which is that, and you've heard this from many of my colleagues, is that many of the things that we're going to do to reduce pollution to the Bay on farmland, in our urban areas, planting trees, implementing rotational grazing, planting cover crops, are going to reduce pollution, they're going to help mitigate climate change, and they're going to make our region more resilient to climate change. So although the challenges are great, I think the good news is that we have these multiple benefits of implementing practices that are good for water quality and have other benefits as well.
Thanks, Beth. And Jacob Fenston, I wanted to give you a chance to ask a follow-up if you had one, or if that answered your question.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Next, we're going to go back to Steve Davies. This is a question about that looks like it's directed to Chris about crabs and oysters. So, Steve, you should be unmuted.
Thanks, AJ. Appreciate it. And please correct any misimpressions I might convey in my question, but it sounds like speaking generally, it was a good year for oysters, but a bad one for blue crabs. Can you explain how both of those statements can be true, taking into account the species habitats and the pollutants that affect them?
Sure. So as I mentioned a little bit, with different species in the bay, whether it be striped bass or oysters or blue crabs, there can be a number of different things that affect them in any given year. And so you obviously brought up oysters and blue crabs. You know, a good example with oysters is they tend to generally thrive in our saltier years. One of the big negatives for the blue crab population and oysters, for the oyster population is big pulses of fresh water coming into the bay. That can be lethal to oysters in kind of the fringe areas in the estuary where there's more fresh water. It also suppresses reproduction of oysters. When it comes to blue crabs, I always kind of describe blue crabs as being confounding. There's so many different things that affect the blue crab population, from the underwater grasses that Beth and I have talked about a lot, their numbers, because that's an area where they hide and where they reproduce. It's also the number of tropical systems that come into the bay, because believe it or not, a lot of the winds from our tropical systems blow larvae back into Chesapeake Bay. Also the amount of predators out there. I mentioned blue catfish in my comments earlier. So depending upon, you know, the number of all those different factors affecting any species, you can have really good reproduction of one species like oysters, you know, for a couple of years, and unfortunately not so great reproduction of blue crabs in those given years in the same Chesapeake Bay. Again, striped bass is another prime example of that. With our warming waters, we haven't had great reproduction of striped bass over the last 4 years as a whole. So every species has kind of a niche that it likes to be successful in, and depending upon what the conditions are in the bay, from dead zones to atmospheric conditions to other habitats, all affect different species differently.
Thank you, Chris.
And thanks, Chris. And I noticed Freddie from the Post has had the similar question, but he had an additional question. So I wanted to unmute him. This would probably be for Chris as well. Freddie, if you can ask that second question that you have. I think Chris just answered your first one. Freddie, you should be unmuted.
Okay. The report mentions that maybe the blue crab population should be managed differently, and I'm assuming that might mean further limits on the catch, but what else would CBF like to see happen in terms of blue crab management to bring it back? And since I'm unmuted, I just one little follow-up would be, what would you guys like to see done about the catfish?
Sure. So thank you for those questions. And blue crab management, I think, is always a topic of discussion in this region. And so, you know, there are a number of things that I think people would like to see. I think, first of all, obviously, we want to see the stock assessment be funded by both Maryland and Virginia during their upcoming legislative sessions to give us better understanding of the population dynamics at this point and allow us to make more informed management decisions. Some of the things that we at least hear a lot about here in Virginia are the amount of effort that's in the fishery. We don't know exactly how many crab pots are out there in any given year. And so that's something that people want to understand much better in the blue crab fishery. Also, obviously, there is some concern about the number of males that we are now harvesting in the fishery, especially here in the lower bay. We used to be a fishery that consisted primarily of females, but as the infrastructure that supports the fishery has changed, we have moved more and more to a male-based fishery. And so that's something that we want to understand the impacts on in terms of its status on reproduction and things like that moving forward. Moving towards blue catfish, the big thing there is making sure we have viable fisheries that can support our watermen who want to harvest blue catfish. There have been some unfortunate negative consequences of federal action, kind of unintended, on our Chesapeake Bay fishery. We were actually required to inspect our blue catfish processing operations. This was actually something that was done primarily to protect other aquaculture-based fisheries in the Mississippi region, and it had a negative effect on our wild-caught blue catfish fisheries here in the Chesapeake Bay region. So removing those barriers for processing and also ensuring that we can develop markets that our watermen can access so they can have viable blue catfish fisheries is going to be really important moving forward.
Thanks, Chris. Freddie, did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And just to stay on this theme, I'm going to go to Rob at 47 ABC next. And then I will get to Everett, Charlie, and John Page, who also have open questions. So let's go to Rob at 47 ABC. This sounds like another question for Chris and also fits in with the climate change theme that we've been discussing. Rob, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that. Our internet dropped out. I was just wondering, in terms of the watermen, just if you had to give a forecast for where they were at, or kind of looking back on what the situation in the Bay was in 2022 for the types of things they were able to catch in terms of their business, and then also kind of forecasting into 2023 and beyond. What do you expect that waterman industry to look like? You mentioned kind of pivoting to the catfish, but strictly speaking with the blue crabs and the oysters, is this a stronger season for them moving forward, or is these climate change challenges that we're talking about starting to impact their ability to have a viable business in the Bay?
So I think I'll maybe answer your last question there first. Obviously, climate change is definitely providing some challenges for our watermen here in the Chesapeake Bay region. Striped bass obviously being one of those. We talked earlier about the fact that striped bass numbers have been down and reproduction has been down for a while, and we're having to make adjustments into the number of fish that folks can catch when it comes to striped bass here in the region. When it comes to other species that we have right now, moving forward, blue crabs, obviously we will get a new stock assessment this spring. We'll get a new estimate of the population this spring, and that will possibly change some of the regulations that we currently have for blue crabs. But I think coming out of last year, most watermen would expect a year that was similar to these last 2 years in terms of harvest, which has been a bit lower than usual. When it comes to oysters, as we talked about earlier, oyster reproduction and the oyster biomass out there has been really good over the last 2 or 3 years. And so I think watermen are expecting good harvest over the next couple of years when it comes to that. I think the important thing there is to make sure we manage our harvest in a way that provides a good harvest to watermen, but also protects enough of that resource and leaves it in the water to ensure that we can maintain that reproductive capacity and have those oysters in the future moving forward. Because that's one thing that we haven't been always great at in Chesapeake Bay when it comes to our oyster fishery, is kind of managing through these cycles and ensuring when the abundance is high, we don't take too many of a good thing.
Thank you, Chris. Next, we're going to go to Charlie Pullen at the Virginia Mercury. I believe this is a question for Hillary. Charlie, you should be unmuted. Yep.
Great. I guess I just wanted to ask, with the results of this report not showing much of an overall change from last year and the recent realization that the pollution reduction goals won't be met by 2025, I guess I just wanted to see, are there going to be any changes to the blueprint or an updated timeline for the reduction goals, kind of resulting with this report being released now? Or?
Hey, thanks, Charlie. And yes, you were correct. The Chesapeake Bay Executive Council announced that the 2025 goals would not be met. I have a few thoughts about that. The first is that the 2025 goals were always an important milestone, and certainly not, the end. It is incredibly important for the states to continue to accelerate their work to meet their watershed implementation plans, and we are expecting that all of them are doing that. And we also understand that EPA is looking at revising the deadline this year. And so we should hear more this fall on that. But there's a lot of work to be done and that it continues. So those efforts by the states and the EPA will continue to make progress. And we're excited to participate in efforts to create more momentum towards those goals.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Next, we're going to go to Caleb Benjamin at the Washington Informer. This sounds like it would be best directed to Keisha. So let's unmute Caleb, please.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering, recently it came out that the EPA had finalized its interim rules for defining waters of the United States. And we're expecting that there might be some changes in the upcoming Supreme Court case. And I'm wondering, will those, will the definition of waters of the US impact efforts to protect the Bay, and what can kind of be done about that as we're waiting for that to be finalized?
Hi, Kayla, thank you. I think, you know, my crystal ball is probably just as good as yours on predicting what's going to come out of the Supreme Court and where all of this is heading for waters of the US. We were really pleased to see the final rule come out for this, like, part one of the Biden administration's WOTUS rehaul, overhaul, whatever we want to call this. It's important because it restored protections for ephemeral streams. There's about, I think the estimate's close to 35,000 acres on the eastern shore of Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia that fall into that category. And so it's really important that we have these federal protections. We're lucky in the region to also have strong state protections for water. So if, like when the Trump administration came into power and revamped WOTUS, made it weaker, you know, we still had kind of a backstop with state regulations, but the federal piece is the most important. And I think, you know, I don't know what the Supreme Court will do. I do not know what it will do to impact WOTUS. All I can promise you is there's going to be challenges right and left. I think it was Senator Capito who's already said that she's looking at Congressional Review Act challenges to the Biden final rule that we saw last week or 2 weeks ago. So that's a really long way of saying I have no clue how this will all play out. I'm just happy that right now we have additional protections for those ephemeral streams here in the watershed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. Next, we'll go to John Page Williams, former CBFer.
Good morning, AJ and other CBF folks. There seems to be an encouragingly large quantity of money on the horizon from both federal and state sources, and probably private sources as well, for conservation practices, both suburban and urban, and on farms. How will CBF track the passage of those monies and the implementation of the programs that they fund to make sure that the money is spent efficiently? And what role will CBF restoration scientists actually play in getting some of those practices into the ground?
Beth, do you want to take this one?
I can speak to the ag. Hey, JP, how you doing? I can speak to the ag part of things. Keisha mentioned one big opportunity in the Inflation Reduction Act to get more conservation dollars into the region. We sent a letter into USDA indicating we want a certain amount of money and we want those dollars to be spent in what has been identified as the most effective basins in the region. So these are areas that have a higher pollution load coming into the bay than certain other areas. So it's basically a color-coded map. And so we've argued that those dollars should be spent mostly in those areas. We want more technical assistance. We've provided some comments on that And we want, we are hoping that practices that have multiple benefits to both water quality and climate change, like the buffers we've been talking so much about and rotational grazing and some of these other practices, are a priority because of the multiple benefits they provide. So as you know, we're advocating at the federal level for that. And then in terms of our use of our restoration staff, yeah, we hope to be involved. One of the programs that's seeing a huge boost in the Inflation Reduction Act is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is a competitive program where a lead partner will propose to USDA where they want dollars to be spent and on what. And so it requires a lot of partnerships, it requires a lead entity. So certainly CVF will hopefully be involved both in dictating where those dollars go, how they are spent, and helping them eventually get on the ground. I can't really speak to the urban side of things. I don't know if anybody else wants.
I think we lost Beth briefly, but she was just mentioning the urban side of things. Anyone want to take a shot at that? I mean, I know here in Maryland, Josh, do you want to talk about in Maryland where some of the grant programs, some of the restoration programs are going to community groups?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, and thank you for the question. Yeah, in Maryland, one of the ways that we do this is through the advocacy process. So a lot of these funds flow through dedicated funding streams that are created by the legislature and administered then by the executive branch. And so what we do is, as these funds are being created or when the funds are being spent, and we hear from our partners, from our community groups, from folks that are implementing these projects for green infrastructure, where there are challenges or issues, we can then go back and work with the legislature to make sure that they are updating those laws to take into consideration those potential problems. So it's a little bit of advocacy, it's a little bit of community building, and a little bit of listening, I would say, and kind of putting those pieces together and helping make those connections so that those funds then flow to the types of projects that are primarily green infrastructure based and give us the most benefit, whether that be local water quality, carbon sequestration, reducing heat, but really trying to find the best places to spend those funds so we can really maximize the benefits that everyone gets there.
Thanks, Josh. We still have a few more questions, so I'm going to keep it moving. It was nice to hear from you, JP. I hope that answered your question. Next, we're going to go to Tori Gates at Radio PA Network. This is a question for Harry Campbell. Tori, you should be unmuted momentarily. Oh, I am sorry. I apologize. Tori does not have a mic, so I will ask this question directly to Harry. Harry, Governor-elect Shapiro has not named a Department of Environmental Protection head at this point. What qualities are you and CVF looking for in a DEP leader that will keep the programs moving forward? Thank you.
Great question. Great question, Tori. First and foremost, someone that is the head of the Department of Environmental Protection needs to be someone who puts people, an advocate for the staff, both new and existing, that reside within the Department of Environmental Protection, that advocates for them in terms of the necessary resources, the tools and technologies for them to do the job that they are essentially obligated to do. And we've seen some change after nearly 20 years hollowing out of DEP over the previous legislature administrations.
Harry,
over the last
we're losing you. Harry, we're losing you a little bit. I think if you just speak up loudly,
Okay.
that might help.
Okay. Hopefully this helps a little bit better. But first and foremost, somebody who puts people first, invests in the staff at DEP. We've seen after 20 years of hollowing out of the agency over the last several years, we've started to see some incremental reinvestment in terms of the number of staff and the infrastructure. And so to continue that, to replenish that staffing levels, which are down to what they were back in the mid-90s, is critically important. And then secondly, someone who is committed to the basic work. It's imperative that the Department of Environmental Protection adhere to their mission. And that includes staff and resources to do inspections. It's to provide the assistance to the regulated community. And of course, it's also that compliance enforcement when necessary to make sure that Pennsylvania's laws, as well as those that are delegated federal laws to Pennsylvania, are enforced to the maximum degree practical. And then finally, someone who embraces innovation, someone who is able to not only put together programs and maximize the strengths of the department, but then bring the partners to the table in order to actually not only meet, but potentially even exceed the regulatory requirements, but provide that baseline on which we can actually see success in our efforts. And then also someone who is advocating each and every day for 21st century infrastructure for the agency, that technology that allows staff to have relevant, accurate, and up-to-date information in order to do their job. So those are the three principles, if you will, attributes that I would consider important for the next DEP sector.
Thanks, Harry. And Tori, if you need better audio of that, we can help you out. Just reach out to me or BJ Small. We can get something better for you. Next, we're going to go to Everett Eaton again with the Virginian pilot. This looks like a question for Beth McGee or Peggy Sand. Everett, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, so in the report, it said that Virginia accounted for over half of the deforestation in the watershed, but there have been increased efforts what did it say? It said that the Virginia continues to accelerate conservation efforts. I was wondering if improving canopy was part of those areas, or if it was more maintaining existing farmland or in open spaces that's referencing.
So Everett, thank you for that question. The forest loss in Virginia is, as you point out, quite alarming, and it's taking place both in our forested regions, but also in our urban areas. And so the work that we are doing and that Virginia is doing, frankly, encompasses both areas, and it needs to be strengthened and extended. Some of the efforts that are ongoing include these. First, we have a new forest sustainability fund. The idea is that from this fund, localities that have forest lands within their boundaries and who take steps to preserve them will be entitled to grants to help incentivize that conservation effort that we hope to encourage in localities. It's a very new program, and I think it needs some guidance before it becomes active, in addition to an infusion of dollars, but it's certainly encouraging that it's now on the books in our laws. Communities in highly developed regions, for example, Northern Virginia, the Richmond metro region, the Hampton Roads area, all of these communities are experiencing very significant ongoing loss of tree canopy. And so there's always if you will, a dialogue between folks on the development side who often have very good ideas for what might, from their perspective, improve the community. And on the other hand, people who recognize that our communities need all of the benefits that a forest canopy and urban canopy provide. And so there's been a lot of work recently to try to tweak the conversation, the regulatory conversation, so that we can accomplish both a strong and vibrant and expanding urban tree canopy, but also development that works for that community. That's an ongoing effort, and you'll see many efforts related to that this year, I anticipate. And on the forestry side, one of the things that we're trying to do in Virginia is to encourage stronger and more extensive growth of our hardwood forests. Some money was put into that effort in this past year. We're hoping that will be increased. Again, this is a beginning effort. Lots of work remains to be done, but we need to look across the Commonwealth at these various areas. So thanks for your question.
Actually, I have a quick, really quick follow-up. Do you anticipate any money being specifically directed to underserved communities in urban areas to improve their canopies?
So a lot of attention is being directed to helping underserved areas increase their tree canopy. And the funding usually comes in the form of grant funding. In other words, either cost shared grants or other grants to help communities to do that. Unlikely to come from a direct appropriation from the legislature, but we think the funding is increasing through the grant methodology. So we're somewhat optimistic that that trend will continue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Everett. And I believe this is our last question from Charlie Paulin at the Virginia Mercury. I think this may go to Hillary or perhaps Beth. Charlie, you should be unmuted.
I did get to ask my question.
He answered the question. Did you have another question, Charlie?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I do actually have a quick one for Peggy, just to clarify the 300 million you mentioned to ask from the General Assembly. That's the total ask you guys are looking for? That includes the 140 million, the grants, and everything else, or are those on top of the 300 million?
So we understand from the wastewater community, those facilities that work together to help upgrade the plants, that the need is as great as 300 million for that sector alone. You might have seen that the governor proposed 237 million to help meet that need, which is, certainly encouraging. We are continuing our ask at the $300 million level because the need is so important. Other areas, agriculture, the need from the state, depending upon how you count it, ranges from 75 million to about 150 million, and happy to talk about details in a different context. But that is separate from the 300 million. And then we're also asking for about 50 million for stormwater related work.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you to all the reporters and other press and others who joined the call today. This concludes the presentation of the 2022 State of the Bay report release. I would like to ask, though, before we formally stop, if Hillary has any comments she would like to make before we conclude.
Just want to thank everybody for joining us today. And while the news is tough today, we are all very optimistic about the future and know that 2025 is an important deadline, but it is not the finish line. And we will be continuing to work to accelerate progress towards each of the state's goals and the overall cleanup effort over the next couple of years and into the future. Thank you, AJ, and thank you all for coming.